All right, here we are, NSCA Chapter 19, talking about clients with nutritional or metabolic concerns. We're now into presentation number 2, which is successful weight management programs for individuals who are obese. And the list to the left is inclusive of a number of different programming interventions, whether it's dietary modification, weight loss guidelines. You provide these different things, ways for your client to basically monitor their lifestyle, reward systems, put those in place. Perhaps there's goal setting or little motivational keys and cues that you can provide. But these are all part of a much bigger picture to help your clients have a better understanding of their situation, to be able to intervene on their behalf or their own behalf, and then to have a positive outcome. And one that's, this is important. I want to point this out. That's not punitive, right? People, it's not like they wake up one day and they weigh 300 pounds or 400 pounds. I mean, that's an incremental thing that happens over time. And oftentimes, at least in my experience, it's a byproduct or a result of some other behavior. And with the medical group that I worked with at one point, most of the people had eating disorders that were a result of some type of not their own doing. It was actually a defense mechanism as a result of somebody else's lousy behavior. And it was a defense mechanism that they used. Either food was their drug of choice, or food was the way they put on weight to protect themselves from somebody who was abusive. So oftentimes, these individuals who have this larger body mass, you'll be confronted with some psychological, emotional issues as well. Not to say everybody, but at least in my experience, what I found, at least working with that group, these were individuals who had to, not only as they went through their weight loss journey, it was challenging, but they also had to unpack some things, if you will, along the way. So if we jump into dietary modification, if you want, you can just pause me as I go through these and you can kind of read to the right. But when you look at weight loss itself, they talk about decreased caloric intake, and they recommend that diet be individually planned to create a deficit of 500 to 1,000 calories per day. So if you have 3,500 calories equals 1 pound of fat, and you have 500 calories a day in terms of deficit over 7 days, that's going to be your 3,500 calories, and that's going to be a pound per week. If you do 1,000 calories per day, that's going to be 2 pounds per week. Now, here's the thing. You can achieve this through either caloric restriction of 500 to 1,000 calories per day, or you can do a combination of perhaps you'll do a 200 calorie caloric restriction and a 300 calorie workout. The net result is still a 500 calorie caloric deficit. And that's kind of what you're after in terms of the math that you're trying to do with your clients, is to get them to understand that movement matters, and then having good food choices also matters. So think of it like, you're putting calories into the food bank or to the calorie bank, and you're just taking calories out and you're trying to withdraw fat calories over and over and over again. So it differs, right? And it differs in terms of how many calories you're going to have per pound, how many calories you're going to have for each individual. So there's certain things you have to evaluate here. And they note, and here's some general guidelines: women should consume diets containing no fewer than 1,200 to 1,500 calories. Men should be no fewer than 1,500 to 1,800. And you look at that for about a 165-pound person. So in essence, what they're saying is, it's not as though you're at 10 calories, if you will, per pound. You're a little bit less than that. You're probably closer to like 7 or 8 calories per pound. But those are like some of the simple math things that you can do to try to figure out how many calories per pound you want the person to consume. And then you can have a further conversation regarding how many are fat, how many are protein, how many are carbohydrates. So when you talk about weight loss, they go back to this. In fact, the literature indicates that a reduction of 3% to 5% of body weight is sufficient to achieve reduction in health risk. And then they go on later on, which is a little bit quirky here, and I didn't like this, but when they talk about this, they go, reducing body weight by 7 to 10% over 6 months is an appropriate initial goal. At that time, new goals can be set, and can be much better to lose moderate amounts of weight relatively slowly than lose large amounts quickly. And I do agree with that, and it should be a progressive thing. But I just didn't want you to get confused between this part here, which 3%, 5%. Over here, they're talking 7 to 10%. And over here, they're talking about a weight loss program that's 10%. Just realize if you're asked on a quiz or the exam for this class, this is what we're going to focus in on. But realize the percentages that we're talking about, those actually change based upon the body that's in front of you. Physical activity. Moderate levels of physical activity for at least 30 minutes most days of the week are recommended for clients who are overweight or obese who are beginning an exercise program. And they go into this in terms of it's the amount of activity that uses approximately 150 calories a day with a total of approximately 1,000 calories per week. So now go back to the dietary modifications, and we were talking, okay, if we're going to go ahead and have a 500 calorie deficit a day, if you have if you have 150 calories from exercise, that means you're trying to cut your calories on the intake side by about 350 calories. So you can play around with this, like we mentioned earlier, to be able to come up with your 3,500 calories per week to burn off a pound of fat. As we take this a step further, they talk about the ACSM recommending a minimum of 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity or 75 minutes of vigorous. So you can play around with it as a trainer, and I urge you to do that so you alleviate some of the boredom that can happen in a weight loss program. You can do longer, slower distance at that moderate intensity. You can do higher intensity work when you're working with your clients, and that's of benefit for your clients to help keep them engaged and involved in the program. And so the key that you have here is they note that for the purposes of weight loss, some individuals may need to progress to 60 to 90 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous. So they're talking about actually having people ramp up the intensity. And I'll tell you, when you have people who are carrying around some extra weight, that will not be comfortable at first, but they will be able to adapt to that and still be able to do the work. But it just takes a little bit of time to ramp them into that type of workload. So if we go into like what is vigorous, and they say more vigorous, less time, less vigorous, more time. So if you're looking at different activities here, stair climbing for 15 minutes, which I think would be pretty darn challenging for most people, and then washing or waxing a car for 45 to 60 minutes. Personally, I would think the stair climbing would be harder, but they're saying the stair climbing is actually going to be only 15 minutes in length, which is kind of quirky here the way they do this. If I can just kind of move myself out of the way here. When I first look at this and I try to kind of overlay playing volleyball to washing or waxing a car, it's difficult for me to say that they are similar. Same thing with stair climbing for 15 minutes or playing basketball for 15 or 20 minutes. For a person who is inherently out of shape, who's trying to lose some weight, who will be carrying extra weight, playing basketball and running up and down a court could be inherently challenging on the orthopedic side of the equation, whereas water aerobics might be more appropriate, or perhaps walking 2 miles might be more appropriate. So, you kind of look at this in terms of what's less vigorous versus more vigorous, and you go stair climbing is more vigorous than washing and waxing a car. I think I might have said that backwards when I first introduced the slide. Sorry about that. But, stair climbing itself is going to be more challenging for sure. Now it becomes, can the person do it? Can you find a way to have them have an activity that's going to be more challenging and more vigorous, and then they'll be able to function the next day, because you want them to have that adherence and you want them to feel like they're having small successes. So sometimes you may have to pick and choose your battles here on what activities you have your person do. And it might be stair climbing one day, but it might be water aerobics the next day, just so you can give their joints a little bit of a break. It could be something as simple as, walking for a little bit or walking for a longer bit. It just depends. Or at least in my case, it could be walking my dog. Now, as we go a little bit further into this, we go lifestyle change, support for obesity, and self-monitoring of lifestyle. The concept is very simple, and I've talked about it before. You have to have the ability to have behavioral change, to have physiological change. And that may require them to have a support system in place. And sometimes they have people in their lives, your client might have somebody in their lives who quite frankly is an enabler and allows them to have lousy food in the house, or matter of fact, has lousy food in the house while your client's trying to lose weight. And it becomes almost like these built-in tripwires around the house, and they're not able to effectively go through the program and lose weight. So you may have to have some conversations with your client on how they can actually advocate on their own behalf with perhaps a roommate, a family member, a loved one, to say, these are things that are kind of triggers for me, and we need to keep them out of the house. And your clients have to have the understanding of being able to recognize those things and then advocate for themselves. You can have your client kind of self-monitor, and you can have them take note of their own activities, what they eat, are they snacking at midnight? Now, I have to tell you, to a certain degree, your clients will lie to you. There will be times where you'll look at them like, this is what you ate, salads and carrots, for a snack. What is this? And to a certain degree, you may have to call people out a little bit, and there's a quirky boundary in there in terms of how far you're willing you can dig in and have it be appropriate. But I'll just say this: you want your client to feel as though they can come to you with this information, and of course, your job is to evaluate, but maybe not scrutinize per se, but coach, mentor, and guide might be the other words you'd rather use as opposed to scrutinize. When we get into reward systems, they can be used to encourage and acknowledge attainment of different goals, weight loss goals, the ability to maybe perform an activity for 30 minutes where before they can only do 15 minutes. You try to find ways to be able to have a reward system in place. And the more you can make these intrinsic, meaning intrinsic to the person as opposed to extrinsic, t-shirts are great, but they only have an effect. They only have a small effect on the person's behavior. You want them to have a way where they're kind of intrinsically hinged or tied to the person that you're working with. And I talk about the kind of tangible versus intangible rewards that they have here. And it could be a balance between any number of different variables: tangible, intangible, extrinsic, and intrinsic. So you as a practitioner have to come up with what your, if you will, reward system that you'd like to use for your clients. And they give you a couple examples here, but this is by no means exhaustive. Now with goal setting, they get a little bit deeper into we can talk about how we're going to set up goals on the front end. I mean, I have my one client that I brought up in class. What she weighs 138 and she wants to weigh 125, and we're going to do monthly weighs each month just to kind of see how she's progressing. And her goal is, if you're going from 138 to 125, that's a 13-pound difference, but it's not going to happen in 1 month. It's going to be over the course of 3 months. And we sat down and we had those conversations regarding how she's going to achieve this. And part of achieving that is the end result long-term goal of losing 13 pounds, but also the short-term or right in front of us goal of, I'm going to work out with my trainer 3 days a week. I'm going to go do boxing 2 days a week. And I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of yoga on my day off. And becomes a conversation of how she's going to meet those goals within the context of her lifestyle and work and family and everything else. So again, it's a behavioral change and behavioral modification that has to happen to be able to elicit the physiological change. And you just have to remind your clients about this and remind them about these things and be aware of, as I mentioned before, some of the environmental triggers that might be in place in their own environment. And it provides perhaps an a tripwire for them, and they're unable to actually meet their goals because they have these environmental things going on, and they have to recognize these things and have a behavioral change so they're no longer surrounded by these different environmental triggers. With food consumption behavior change, I oftentimes talk with clients on the front end about you either need to eat less of what you're eating or you got to eat better stuff. It's tough to eat less and eat better at the same time. You almost have to kind of wean people off of the lousy food and then have them eat less lousy food, or have them try to introduce in with their lousy food maybe some salads and some other calories from good foodstuffs, and that way they can make better choices. And then they end up having more success as opposed to just completely going cold turkey. And they know it here where they feel deprived. They feel deprived of what they enjoy eating, but they also feel deprived in terms of their caloric intake. So I'm going to back it off right here. I'm going to go into my next presentation, and I'll be right back.